One of the things that I had found really interesting from the story that you had told me on LinkedIn is that Lavender actually started with the mission of helping job seekers land jobs by writing better messages. If you don't mind, I'd love to just hear a little bit more about that. Like, what was the motivation behind that, and like, what was that story?
Yeah, so the origin story of Lavender is twofold. One, yes, original product was an immediate reaction to COVID, and we thought it could help people find jobs. But kind of how we got into Lavender, it begins before that. And I'm sure we'll dive deeper into it later, but quick overview, Lavender is a Chrome extension that helps people write better emails faster for a variety of use cases, and the primary one being sales and sales reps. But many things in life are a sale, including finding a job. So prior to Lavender, our team was building a psychology-based marketing tech product. We had just finished up some successful pilots. We were all set to launch in around March of 2020. And then COVID kind of happened. Everyone stopped investing in marketing spend. There was tons of uncertainty. We had this product we had built that part of it included analyzing marketing copy and looking for things that were predictors of successful ad campaigns, either for an email campaign or like a Facebook social campaign. And we kind of had no options on where to sell it. We were about to launch a product in COVID when everyone was not spending in marketing. We lost our pipeline, lost our pilots, and had a lot of uncertainty around where we're going to go as a business. But we had these two different assets. We had some data on people, we knew how to get data on people, and we had this new writing analysis technology we just built for marketing. And we saw this massive shift to remote first. And we thought, by the very nature of going remote, people are going to be sending more emails. And we thought there were a lot of different use cases for where this could be applied, like taking our technology that had been used to analyze marketing copy for one-to-many campaigns and then tweaking it to be more for one-to-one emails. We thought this could help people that were trying to find jobs, people that were trying to find employees, human resources, sales, customer success, marketing. There were many, many use cases. And the one that was the most immediate in that point in time was people trying to find jobs. So when we first launched it, we just kind of put it out there with no intended B2B use case other than this will help you write better emails. And a lot of people picked it up for helping them find jobs. Either it was students trying to find an internship or even their first job, or people who had been laid off. And even to this day, we offer Lavender Pro for the unemployed, job seekers, and students for free to help them find their job.
I love that. That's awesome. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. And I guess just by way of context, just to give you a little bit of background. So, I've spent most of my career in sales. It's been about 20 years now. And right around the beginning of COVID, I was a partner at a consulting firm, and unfortunately, a lot of our clients were, affected negatively by COVID. And I saw a lot of people being laid off, and it wasn't really at any fault of their own. They were top performers. So, we set out to help, and I was kind of looking around the market, figuring out like, do I want to keep? I wanted to keep working. I knew that I wanted to stay busy, and I was trying to figure out like what can I do that isn't necessarily going to need to create demand. And recruiting was one of those areas where I felt like, companies were saying, hey, we have a budget, we have a need for something, and they're kind of putting out the RFP, if you will. And so we started making some of those connections, and we found that it was no longer enough to even have an intro or a referral as a candidate. The market was very tough. And it was becoming really difficult to stand out. Rather than helping companies source talent, we decided to help candidates find jobs. And very quickly, we realized, as you mentioned, that the job search is very much like a B2B sale. And, in the same way that you need to brand yourself and stand out and pattern interrupt and control the interview process and negotiate and close the deal, et cetera, many of the same principles apply to someone's job search. So it's really interesting that you say that and you guys kind of recognize that early on. I really like how you mentioned that from, one to many to one-to-one. Was there any like big differences that you found between going one to many versus one-to-one when it comes to like effective messaging?
Limited, actually. So a lot of the things that were predictors of successful short or longer form, if it's an email campaign, or really short form, if it's a Facebook ad campaign, a lot of the predictors linguistically of a successful ad campaign, we've seen have carried over into these one-to-one emails. Things like writing concisely and with brevity and to the point, and not using complex language, getting your point across in a very simple way, which is actually one of the main things that most people actually struggle with. Conveying confident and friendly tones. A lot of times people's natural writing style, especially if they're in their mind like the less important person in the communication. So for example, a job seeker trying to find a job, there's like this sense of uncertainty in their language. They're like unsure if they're qualified or just how they come across. And this is something that the human eye in a lot of cases can't pick up. Even us, we know what to look for. We can't really say this is the sentence that's going to cause this, but the machine can find it. So when we were first doing the early case studies, some of the things that we were finding that actually would double return on ad spend for one of our pilots with this marketing focused product was things like using uncertain language or unfriendly language, or even gender leaning language. Like in this one case, it was an all female marketing team, and we found that all of their ad copy was female leaning. And then they had a problem where they weren't converting male buyers, and we changed all their language to gender neutral, and automatically they had more male buyers. So things like that, like you're not noticing, whether it's a one-to-many ad campaign or a one-to-one sales email or a one-to-one email trying to find a job, it's all somewhat similar in that the same types of things, largely being like gender neutral, especially if you're going after a mixed audience, being simple, being confident, being friendly, these kind of like golden rule type things of communicate how you'd like to be communicated to we're seeing work regardless of the medium that people are using it for. People use Lavender for sales emails, marketing emails, Facebook, LinkedIn posts. We had a user write a speech that he gave to the Washington DC City Council using Lavender. And it's just the same thing applies across the board. The only thing that might change is the length. Like in a sales email, an email of a 50 to 100 words is great. If you're writing a marketing newsletter or a cover letter, perhaps you might want to go a little bit longer. But generally, even the word count will apply in a lot of cases. Being short, to the point, and concise really helps.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that seems to come up a lot. Dong recently released a study, I don't know, Devin Reed, about follow-up emails and how longer follow-up emails actually have a higher response rate than shorter follow-up emails. Did you find the same with job-related emails where, maybe you start off a little bit shorter and then go a little bit longer, or not so much?
So as far as like hard data around what's working in a traditional sale email versus what's working in a job specific sale email, I don't have that data because we're not diving that granular into our users' email use case. But in general, we're finding across the board that shorter emails work better. If you're in a follow-up situation and you're answering questions, especially, or you're trying to convey more information, and you've already kind of warmed that lead in the first touch email, and there's some quote brand recognition, whether about your brand or even your personal brand, meaning your name, a little bit longer can work. But what we're finding pretty much across the board is if the email takes longer than 14 seconds to read, your chance of getting a reply starts to decline. And I would assume that would be the same within a recruiting email, especially if you're doing a direct email to a decision maker, because the same problems that an executive's facing when they get an inbound email from a seller, it's the same that they're facing when they get an inbound email from a potential hire, is that their email is cluttered. There's lots of noise. They treat their email like it's a to-do list. So when they get more emails coming in, it's more things for them to do. And emails that don't have like empathy for how the executive reads their email end up getting deleted. Someone decides if they're going to delete their email within the first 3 seconds, and it's largely based around the formatting of the message. They quickly look at it, generally on their cell phone. They're 8 times more likely to open it on their cell phone. And if it looks like it's poorly formatted, long-winded, hard to read email, it kind of reminds them of more work or homework if they're thinking about school, and they tend to just not read these emails and delete them. So same types of things work for follow-ups, for first touch, for recruiting, for selling, pretty much across the board, because it comes down to the psychology of the person that's actually reading that email and how they're experiencing their inbox.
What you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like showing empathy. It doesn't necessarily mean, hey, like, sorry to disturb you, but right? Or I don't mean to interrupt your day, or, hope all is going well. These are some of the things that we hear a lot in some of these emails. And I think people maybe misinterpret it as showing empathy, right? But like you were mentioning earlier, that's sort of, like almost like negotiating from a point of weakness and assuming that the person doesn't want to hear from you. I really like that, like showing, not telling, that you have empathy for the reader.
I think that's key. So these phrases, which people think are empathy or just building rapport, hope this finds you well, unprecedented times, sorry to bother you, I know you're busy, things like that. It's kind of fluff. It doesn't really add much to the argument or to the case of the writer. And it just adds unnecessary filler for the reader. And it doesn't really come off to them as real empathy. Showing empathy for the reader, just like you said, it's an action. So understand that they're busy. Don't tell them that they're busy, but know that they're busy and use your best effort to write an email that's made for a busy person. You get to the point and it's easy for them to quickly scan it on their phone, especially, or even something as simple as making sure the first sentence of the email hooks them, because that's what they see first. It's called the preview text. It's the sentence that they see in their desktop window. It's the sentence they see in a notification on their phone. It's also what they see on their watch if they get a notification on their watch. So that first sentence really determines, are they going to A, open the email, B, are they going to read it? And if you fill that space up with hope this finds you well, sorry to bother you, not only are you coming off from in a more unsure tone, and in some cases that can be interpreted as a position of weakness, it also just fills up the space. And if every person that's sending those emails, every seller or applicant, starts off their email with the exact same language, hope this finds you well, et cetera, you're not going to stand out in that inbox when they're scanning their inbox and they only see the preview text, which is the first sentence of the email. So yeah, I don't think you should use any of those things that you mentioned. It comes off unsure. It can come off from a weakness standpoint. It also is just fluff. And if you've got 14 seconds to hook someone on your email and you've got 3 seconds to hook them to actually keep reading, filling that up with fluff just takes away from the effectiveness of the email.
Yeah, that's a really great point, especially when you're looking on mobile. So I guess to that point, have you found that certain phrases or certain like angles have worked better in that preview text than others?
It's going to be nuanced depending on what you're selling, what you're trying to accomplish. But there's a saying in marketing, like, don't bury the lead. Don't put like the main thing you're trying to accomplish way down at the bottom, because people aren't going to necessarily get there in a lot of cases. So if you're a job applicant and you've got something that's like really important, like you have a quantifiable success that you've done in your past role, I've increased sales by 40% or done whatever, like you can lead with that because that's something that's inherently interesting. Or if it's something that is more of a sales focused email, or even honestly, if it's a recruiting email, show you've done some research about the company that you're targeting or the recruiter or the executive that you're targeting. Like, I just saw this podcast or this tweet or this LinkedIn post that you or your company has made, and you have identified that you're really focusing on X, on growing this part of your product or this part of your team, or et cetera. I've done an insert thing that you've done that aligns with what they've recently said they're trying to accomplish. And then you've shown that the email is not a spammy email. It's not a templated email, whether it's a sales email or a recruiting email. You showed you've done your research, and then you've tied something that's an accomplishment of yours back to the mission or the goal or the update that you've read about your prospect. In this case, the prospect could be whoever's in charge of hiring you.
On a similar topic, so when it comes to subject lines, obviously the length of your subject line is going to affect the length of the preview text. Have you found that shorter subject lines, longer subject lines, is there a certain number of words, and just in general, like what makes up an effective subject line in your perspective?
So from a format, there's two ways to look at that question. One is the formatting of the subject line. And yes, there are best practices related to the formatting of the subject line. And then the other side of that is the content of the subject line. Best practices are showing things like don't use punctuation, don't use numbers, don't use symbols. These all have an impact. This is data from SalesLoft on decreasing open rates. But I think the most important one around formatting is the length. A lot of subject lines that I receive from people that email me, they're really long, they want to be really descriptive, or they look like they're a template. It's like first name hyphen whatever. And you can kind of tell that these are a templated email, or they're just too long. And the downside of the lengthy subject line is that it decreases what I'm seeing when I get a notification on my phone or on my watch, or even the preview text on the desktop. Now, when it comes to the content of the email, I think use your best judgment on, is this something that would stand out or be interesting to me? Personally, if I've done the research on someone and I'm doing personalization, I know something about them, I might incorporate that in that subject line, something that is going to like make sense to them in these 2 or 3 words that I have. Even just something as like quick question or basic stuff, like things that would make you want to open an email. Try to do something that piques curiosity or interest, or even just something that that would just be different than what everyone else is sending. And lots of times everyone else is sending are things like first name brackets company, which used to work really well. And there was a sales thought leader that suggested that recently on a webinar. And the next email I sent with that format, I went to spam. So I feel like if everyone is sending the exact same formatting, then you're increasing your chances of landing in spam. So I kind of like the anti-rule here is don't do it all the sales influencers are saying to do, because those types of tactics end up getting saturated where everyone's doing them, and they're more likely to land you in spam or just be ignored by the recipient. So be authentic. If you can solve a problem, maybe call that out, but try to keep the subject line to 2 or 3 words, whatever you end up doing. And just think about it as like the only purpose of the subject line is get them to open the email. The subject line plus the first sentence is what they're going to see, and that's what makes them decide if they're going to open. So a lot of times people will use a subject line that is like the first or the intro, and then that first sentence kind of continues that thought to kind of hack around getting a longer thought into the subject line. But it's really a short subject line and a longer preview text, and they can complete that thought. So a few different ways to look at it. Just be short and try to stand out, I think would be the framework I'd run any ideas through.
I've been thinking about that a lot lately, with a lot of these big influencers that you see on LinkedIn, like you see a lot of, similar advice, and it's really great advice, but if everyone started doing it, then by definition, you're not going to stand out anymore. So, I really like that idea. It's almost like if you go back 6 months and take a look at what they were saying, maybe do that 6 months later instead of doing what they're saying today. It's interesting. Sure. I saw that there's like a new feature that you guys came out with. It's called Next Best Action. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And I have a few follow-up questions that I think will come out of it, but what is that new feature all about?
Sure. So this is maybe a good time to introduce more about what Lavender does and how it can help both sellers and people try to find jobs. So cold emails are important, like across a lot of different use cases. And I've randomly been watching a lot of podcasts recently with people that you would know, like pretty famous people, and they're talking about how they got these opportunities or they got their role in the podcast or what have you from a cold email. And it's something that's kind of ubiquitous around life, is the power of a cold email, especially if you're a seller, like it's our core focus. And then also if you're trying to find a job and you've got to do like recruiting through the internet. So Lavender helps with that. Lavender is an email assistant that exists within the inbox. And as someone is writing their email, it shows them helpful data on the person they're emailing, so they can quickly learn about them and use that for personalization and quick research. There's a sidebar, it shows their picture, their school, their bio, their social posts, and things like that. Then as you're writing the email, it helps you with that. It tells you if you've done something that's going to decrease your chance of getting a reply, or you've made a big mistake, like you've misspelled your prospect's name or made a grammatical error, or you are just doing things that are not optimized for a reply, like writing an unsure email or writing a pushy email, and so on and so forth. And along that thread of what we're trying to help people accomplish, which is write better emails faster, part of that faster part is telling them what their next best action is. So you've made a mistake. Well, what do you need to do now to fix that mistake? And in some cases, we'll give you a new sentence. So like you've written a sentence that comes off as unsure and weak, we'll give you a sentence that's more confident. And as we keep building the product out, a lot of what's coming around is next best actions more tailored to you specifically. So as you keep using Lavender, it's learning about you as a person and what you're trying to accomplish and who you're targeting and what's getting you more positive replies with that specific use case that you have as an individual. So over time, these next best actions that alert you of what you should do next begin to be more tailored to you, or if you're on a team, to your team. It could be anything from saying like, hey, your email is great, but it's not optimized for mobile, so let's help you fix that. Or hey, we've detected a formatting issue and you should fix that right now. It's going to lower your chance of getting a reply by 4% or what have you. So as you're writing the email, it gives you these next best actions so you can have the best chance based on the hard data of getting a positive reply to your email.
Are you seeing, so a couple questions that I have in mind, and again, we don't necessarily have to go too deep into this, but are you taking into account, like I've seen other apps in the market that will basically try to assess the personality of the person that you're reaching out to. So obviously if the person's like very dominant or very analytical or very excited, etc., it'll show you how to mirror that. Are you seeing a big correlation between that sort of personality assessment and success with emails, or not so much?
We could have an entire podcast on this topic. So before we were building Lavender, our team was building this psychology marketing technology. And part of what it would do is take an email list, let's say it's 1 million people, then analyze all the data on the people on that list, then make a prediction of what their personality type is for the purposes of marketing, and giving them different types of campaigns based on how their personality came back in this algorithm. And I think the short answer to your question is maybe. In some cases, this might work. But I think the problem that, and I know the companies that you're talking about, and we're not competitive with them, but I think in the future we will be, because we are pulling, in an upcoming release, we're pulling some of the information that we had built in our previous marketing product that got sunset because of COVID. We're tying some of that information into Lavender. We will do a personality analysis on your prospect and give you suggestions based on their personality. But the issue with some of these other technologies is that a lot of times they're enhancing their data set off of how the personality is based on how they're communicating on their LinkedIn profile or in their email. And I had an experience where I was using one of these tools in an old sales job like 5 years ago, and the personality it had when I was at my job compared to my personal email was a lot different. So how I communicated at my job in a sales role was a higher dominance score. And then in my personal email, or even in my email when I left my job to do a startup, was more collaborative. So same person, but one of them I was in a quota carrying role, and I had to be more aggressive to get those deals done. And in a more collaborative startup environment, I didn't have to do that as much. So that would have missed the mark if someone was trying to email me and they had the wrong email address. So the way we think about it is not what's your personality overall, but how are you communicating in the specific situation? So the way you're communicating in a sale versus recruiting versus going to buy a car or whatever, it could all be different. So Lavender looks for something, we call it read the room. So how is this other person communicating right now? And maybe in this specific conversation, they're being more analytical, or they're being more aggressive, or they're being more collaborative. And that may be different than how they communicate normally. So we're looking at it more like what's happening right now. That said, one of the things we have coming out soon is taking the concept that you mentioned around these tools that predict personality, taking it one step further. We're not so interested in what their personality is. We're interested in how they make their decision. So some of the IP that we had built when we were doing the marketing startup before Lavender was taking data around someone's personality prediction and converting that into a prediction of how they make their decision. There's something that I learned about while doing a fundraiser for a women's college several years ago called the Hermann brain dominance instrument. And we're really influenced and inspired by this. And what this it basically says is that people make decisions in 4 quadrants: action, vision, people, and data. This is used a lot in HR at like Fortune 100 companies and the government to structure leadership teams. Everyone looks through decisions in these 4 quadrants: action, vision, people, and data. But kind of based on their personality and who they are, they go into them different orders and different magnitudes. So some people are more action oriented, some are more data oriented, some are more people oriented. And this is pretty consistent, unlike how you communicate based on your personality could be changing based on situations. How you think through a decision remains pretty consistent from the time you kind of go through puberty and move forward. So we're looking more at that. We had built this IP that would basically convert the personality data into a prediction on the dominant quadrant of decision making for whoever it is you're targeting. So what Lavender will have very soon is some of that built in that says the person you're targeting is more data driven. Therefore, you should include more facts in this email. Or this person is more people oriented. Therefore, you might want to talk about how this buying decision will influence the people around them or their company, or maybe include testimonials. So we're thinking of it more in that angle of A, how are they communicating in this specific situation? And B, how do they generally think through a decision? And how can you use that to give them the things that they need to see for it to make sense in their head? So for example, some people who are action oriented, they can probably get to conviction in this decision, whether it's to hire someone or buy something, whatever it is, without having to go through a white paper or a graph. Like they can just move with their gut, make decisions based on how they feel. And then other people who are, say, more data driven, if you don't send these additional details and your email is really, really short, for example, and has no context or no detail, they're going to feel like something is missing. They're not going to have enough information to make their decision. But it's going to be a little bit different than what you're thinking about with the current players in the market that are just taking a prediction of personality and using it as like a general recommendation for every situation. It's going to be a little bit more nuanced than that.
That's really interesting. I haven't heard of that like construct before. I'll have to look into it. That's really cool. That's really awesome that you guys are coming out with that. It makes a lot of sense. Another question I had related, what I've found from prospecting and even from job searching as well, like, you know, the information that people give you online is gold, right? And if they're more active on LinkedIn, like that's going to give you a lot of really great insight into who they are. But for a lot of people that are, you know, maybe, I don't want to generalize, but for a lot of people who maybe are working at like a Fortune 100 or sort of like more like a corporate kind of a role, maybe within like consumer goods or other sectors, that they might use LinkedIn more of just like a kind of standing resume, and they might be browsing and lurking, if you will, and maybe liking and commenting every once in a while, but they're not necessarily actively posting. Have you seen any of these sort of you know, dynamics that you're finding with Lavender change based on interacting with people who maybe aren't as socially active online versus people who are?
The majority of people on LinkedIn are not actively contributing content. They're more of like lurkers. And I think that's most people in general. Obviously, if they're active on LinkedIn or any other social media platform, that's a wealth of information on what they're thinking, how they're feeling, what's relevant to them. This can be used as points of personalization. Personally, I like Twitter because Twitter is less noisy. So most people, if they're active on LinkedIn and they're a decision maker, they have lots of people engaging them on LinkedIn. Where on Twitter, most people don't have as large of a following and they still get notifications to their phone. So I think Twitter is like an underutilized channel. You can DM someone, you can just comment on their stuff and they get that notification on their phone. So that's a kind of a side tip for the audience. But in specific, like how do you communicate with someone if they're not active on LinkedIn and you're trying to find a job? I think there's a few things you can do. One, look, just Google them, Google their name, see, are they on podcast? Have they written a blog for their company? Is there even just a profile on this person on their company's website that might have some things in it where you can build commonality or just see what's important to them? If you can't find anything on that person in particular, you need to look more about the company or the industry. So if you understand your target market, whether it's a company you're trying to get a job at or a company you're trying to sell into, like have some understanding of their industry or what they're selling or what the problem it is that they're solving. And then you can start to extrapolate insight from, say, a press release they've made or even tweets or LinkedIn posts from the company and say, hey, I just recently saw that X happened, and I think I can be helpful in Y way based on what I've read. And even if your specific recipient did not write that post or was not active on LinkedIn, I think you can still use this connection as a way to personalize and more importantly, build relevance. And this could be for whatever you're trying to do, whether it's get a job or sell a product or whatever else. Just showing that you have whatever you're trying to offer to them. It might be yourself, it might be your services, it might be your product. Whatever you're trying to offer to them is relevant to their specific problems and their to-do list. And it's easier if they're individually writing about this in a LinkedIn post, but you can still just take one extra step and kind of figure it out just from reading about the company or even their industry. So another, like you might even see like, let's say it's the airline industry, if we just threw that out, just picked it out. There are tons of articles during COVID about how people were not traveling as much. So you could, if you're looking for a job, you might find that like, hey, I see a major problem to you right now is that people aren't traveling as much. I have some ideas or I have some experience around how to increase the amount of times that your frequent flyers travel so you can increase more revenue from the ones that are traveling or something like that. Like you can take industry level insight and use that on a more personal basis if it's relevant to what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I really like the idea of like looking at company bios or press releases and other ways that you might be able to glean some information. We hear a lot of on LinkedIn, and we see a lot of data around like calls to action and, you know, leading with like an interest CTA versus like booking a meeting CTA, and also just how quickly you need to get into sort of like your pitch, right? I think, you know, in general, like humans are humans, and most of us want to know if it's relevant, and we want to know that there's some credibility built in, and we want to, you know, understand that there's some empathy there. But are you finding that with maybe I'll call them kind of more corporate, like not as active folks versus very active folks? Are you finding a difference between like getting directly into, hey, this is the problem we're solving, this is how we solve it, versus like, hey, can we start a relationship? Can I have you on my podcast? You know, like kind of more of like that slow play. Are you seeing that like more active people want more slow play versus not, or vice versa?
I think in general, people want that. People want this relationship and not to feel like they're a number or a lead in a CRM. So I've got like a bunch of thoughts on this. And one, it's going to start with this idea of reframing in the mind of the writer, whether it's for recruiting or sales. And I think just moving forward, the audience should understand that when I'm talking about a sales email, this also applies to a recruiting email in almost every case. It's about what we call at Lavender a CTC, not a CTA. And CTC means call to conversation. The entire point of an email, whether it's the first email or the fifth email and they've not responded, the only point of that email is to get a reply. All the other things that you're trying to accomplish, get them on the phone, book a meeting, get an interview, book a demo to sell your product, whatever it might be, everything you're trying to accomplish is going to come after you get that first positive, ideally, reply. And that's different than what most people are doing. What most people are doing, whether it's them trying to get a job, we get a lot of these, whether they're trying to sell a product, it's a LinkedIn DM, whatever it is, it's always a lot about them. Here's my product, here's what I do, here's some logos you may or may not know. Do you have 15 minutes? And that's every single email. And I think what people don't realize, if they're in the seat that sends a lot of emails, is how the recipient experiences those emails. And we get a lot of inbound emails, and we're a pretty small company. So imagine how many emails you're getting if you're an executive at like a Fortune 500 company, you're getting tons. So if every email you're receiving is the exact same format, it's here's a lot about my company, here's my problem or my product, here's a question of book a meeting, do a demo, let's do an interview, here's my Calendly link, all these things. These just get ignored because it's what everyone's getting. There used to be a time in sales where volume was the competitive advantage. If you could send more emails than the person next to you, you had a competitive advantage, or make more phone calls. And it's not the case anymore because everyone can do that. Everyone has auto dialers and they're dialing hundreds of dials an hour. They have cadencing tools where they're able to send hundreds of emails at a push of a button or thousands of emails at a push of a button. And they're all the same. So the average executive is getting lots of these templated, cadenced emails that are to them just like spam. The way to do that is to introduce pattern interruption. And I'm not talking about some sales tactic or something like that. It's just to be authentic and humanize that experience a little bit more. And typically when you first meet someone, you're not just going out and saying, here's my entire resume, my entire life story. You ask them a question or you get to know them a little bit. So what we're seeing works best is just having a really short email, not saying a lot about your product or service. Maybe not even pitching your product in that first email, just optimizing all your mental energy on getting a reply. And that, in many times, that can imply the pain point you solve or the product that you have. I think a way to do it is, if you think about a format for an email, the first sentence could be short sentence about personalization, like you've seen something that's relevant to what you're about to say, then ask them a question. And that question can imply what it is that you do, what you're trying to solve. It may never even explicitly state what you're trying to do. For Lavender, and I'm just spitballing here, maybe we could say something like, would it be helpful if you could see which of your sales reps were not going to hit quota this month in their email, or something like that. And we may never even mention what Lavender does, but the person, and I probably would refine that before actually sending. I just thought of it, but they understand that whatever I have or the next email is going to be something that will solve a pain point around sales reps not hitting quota. So I would think of this question mentality more than trying to book a meeting or book a demo. If your first email to a person has a calendar link in it or tries to book a meeting. I call it a calendar close, trying to close on the calendar in that first email, your chance of getting a reply is going to go down. So lead with getting a conversation started, a call to conversation over a call to action.
That's interesting. How do you close out those emails? Like, what does that final sentence look like? Is there even a question in there in the final sentence?
It depends. I don't think you need a final sentence. You could literally accomplish this with 2 sentences. The first sentence is, hey, I was reading this article about your company and saw X. 2, here's a question. 3, thanks. So the way I like to look at email and just sales in general, it's probably one of the foundational ways of how I thought through like a lot of things. My first sales job, the owner of the company, small company, so he was my direct manager, had me watch this YouTube series called Veto to Veto. And Veto to Veto stands for very important top officer to very important top officer. And the kind of the thinking behind it, if I summarized it, is pretend you are that very important top officer. So if you're emailing a CEO, pretend you are a CEO, act as if you are them. And I think his perspective was, I was a 21-year-old sales rep trying to email business owners. So, but don't feel like you're in this weaker position. You have something important, you can help them, talk to them as if you were their peer and their equal. And I think the same is true in email. If you notice the types of emails executives send, they're very rarely long. They're a lot of times, and I do it myself, and I'm just a lower level executive here, may ask a question in the subject line and the email has nothing in it. And people communicate that way, or they have a very short email, often limited fluff. And the difference is the emails that they're receiving look nothing like that. So I don't think a third sentence as like a rule is necessary. It might be a way to add extra information. If there's something completely relevant to that person, it might be something to do here. And it could also be tailored to the situation. Like if you're trying to find a job and you email me, just ask me one question, there might not be like the context there where I can necessarily understand that you're trying to get a job. So if you're trying to get a job, maybe your email is a little bit longer and that third sentence might be like, I did XYZ at my last company that was successful. And it might need extra context. But if you're a sales rep trying to get a conversation started, you might be able to get that accomplished with one sentence that intros or personalizes and one sentence that asks a question. And one of the best emails I received was from a sales rep. One of his colleagues had been trying to pitch me and was not getting very far. And he was doing the standard method of, here's a lot about my company. Do you have 15 minutes? And then he'd follow up and say more about his company. Do you have 15 minutes? And I just kind of ignored them. And then one of his coworkers emailed me and started off with about some personalization about me, super lightweight, just saw reference a post I had made a few days prior. Then he asked me a question and he used a multiple choice question. It was like ABC. The question and the answers implied what they did in their pain point and their value prop without ever mentioning what their product does to me. And he just said, reply back A, B, or C, like reply back with one letter. And it was super simple to do. And I felt like compelled to close the loop and answer that question. And I did. So he got the conversation started. And I think that is how you should be thinking about it. That's a good like example of the old way of thinking where this one rep sent like the standard template and this more like conversation focused way of looking at it.
Yeah, I love that, man. I wish there was like, we were on stage and there was like pyrotechnics or something like that. Veto to veto. That's awesome. That's so true. Final two questions. First, in general, I mean, we've talked a lot about email. We've talked a lot about, subject lines. We've talked about, calls to conversation, and this has all been super helpful and a lot of things that, I haven't heard before, and it's going to help a lot of people. Do you have other advice for job seekers? You know what the market is like right now. It's been pretty tough for a while. It's going to continue to get tougher. I don't necessarily think it's ever like an easy job search necessarily, but do you have general advice that you would typically give to job seekers when they're looking to stand out?
I think that is the advice. You have to stand out. It's very similar to how I talked about cold email. If you're in a competitive market, whether your competitive market is other people trying to sell a similar product or service, your competitive market is you trying to sell yourself and get a job, how do you stand out when everyone's doing the exact same thing? So it's kind of like when you're in high school and applying to colleges and like do all these extracurriculars and things that help you stand out. It's kind of the same. I think what people are so used to is having to have a resume, and they go into a job search and they have this resume. I've never actually used a resume to get a job. I've just shown up. And if you're in a sales environment, I think it's a little bit easier versus if you're like a doctor or something, you might want to have a resume of like, here, I went to school. But in general, especially for salespeople, if you can just sell yourself or show a way that you've stood out, you've had a personal project, it might seem completely unrelated to the topic that you're, or the task or the job you're trying to get, but it's going to help you stand out and shows you have you're self-starter, you have some ambition. Two people that have applied to Lavender stood out to me the most. And we were looking for a role, and one person was like, I'm interested, how much does it pay? And another person wrote in and said, I don't care about money, I care about working with smart people and solving hard problems. And that stood out to me. Most people don't write in and ask and say they don't care about money. Most people write in asking, what's the salary? What's the on-target earnings? Things like that. And what we're looking for, especially in our earlier stages, is people that can really get in and buy in with us and build something from the ground up. So in our situation, the person that's more like collaborative, wants to solve hard problems, understands that it's hard, they stood out more. And then as you dove deeper, it's like, what things are interesting to you right now? And that person was like, well, I'm taking these classes in my spare time about machine learning. I want to get better at AI. And so we're thinking, okay, well, he's spending his spare time learning things that would eventually be applicable in our role. So we can assume that there's upward mobility for that person, and he can expand in his role. That's like a very specific situation that happened to us. But I think the lessons there apply no matter what you're trying to do. So if you're looking at all the people that you're competing with, they're all going to probably have some degree of background that might be relevant. And that's like table stakes in the situation. So what are the things that are unique to you, whether it's a hobby or a project you've worked on, or even a life experience? Like, I traveled the world and I learned about all these different cultures. I can apply that in this customer service role because I'm empathetic to tons of different types of people. Whatever it is that you're trying to get across, like, what are these special things that are unique to you, and how do they fit in with what this company's trying to do? And the company's trying to build and provide value to their customers and their shareholders, and they're looking for people that are going to help them do that in their own special way. So I don't think there's like a specific tactic or hack to get a job, but it's understanding that you're competing against everyone else, and companies in today's world are less focused on what's on the resume and what's unique about that person, and how can that unique person really contribute to what the company is trying to accomplish. And I think if you look at it from that angle, a lot of the things that might seem irrelevant to you, or irrelevant in like the job search that's unique to you, might actually be what's really important and gets you the job. So looking for those special things that are yours that help you stand out, even though it sounds cliche, I think that's what actually works.
No, that's great advice. And I think it helps you like build confidence too. And obviously Lavender sounds like a great tool. You know, I've played around with it myself, and I know a lot of people who have, and I've heard some like really great reviews. But let's say that, you know, I'm someone who's a job seeker. I use Lavender to land my job. I get into my new role and I realize that the company's not using Lavender. How have you seen be the most successful way to position Lavender to leadership, and kind of what's your advice for someone who wants to maybe bring Lavender in?
It's a great question. And obviously I'm biased here, but I'd encourage everyone to try to bring Lavender into their company. I think the best case here, the best example, is a story of how we got one of our best clients, Brex. It's a fintech company that really sells like financial services to startups primarily, but also scale ups. And one of their sales reps found our product and started using it on a free trial. And while he was trialing the product, he got promoted to a sales manager. And one of the first things he did was schedule a demo with Lavender to get his entire team on the product, and did a pilot for 2 weeks. And then they got approval, and we got security compliance, and now they're a customer. And I think that's the best way to really sell it into an organization. Is there's a free trial. It's a product-led company. Install it, try it. Do you do one or two of both, or both of these things you're trying to accomplish? Can you write better emails? Are they more effective? And do you get through outbound messaging faster? And it's a given across the board that most likely your company sends emails in some capacity. Some might say, well, my sales job, for example, is mostly phone heavy. I'm sending most of my emails, or doing most of my selling through phone. And even if that's true, most likely you're sending emails as well. one of our users who works at a company called Gong, they do sales phone call analytics. She was telling me that 30% of her day is spent spending emails, and their entire company is around sales phone calls. So you're probably sending sales emails and they probably take a lot of time. The average personalized email for a sales rep, and this probably is true for other professions as well, takes 15 to 20 minutes. That adds up throughout the day. So you want to reduce the amount of time you're spending writing emails, and you want to get more replies, more positive replies to those emails. So Lavender helps with both. So how I think about selling it into an organization is, first of all, try it out, see if it works for you individually, and then go tell your manager, like, hey, this got me more replies, more positive replies, and I reduced my outbound time by 30%. Let's try it on the team. And I can say with full confidence, you're going to get somewhere close to doubling your positive reply rate, and you're going to get through your outbound messaging 30, maybe even 50% faster, just based on what we're seeing from our users.
That's huge. Yeah, that's definitely big. Can take a long time to structure these emails. So I can see how this sort of like helps you get there, sort of like a personal trainer at the gym or like an accelerant for your sales team. That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I love hearing that story. Was there anything else that you wanted to cover before I stopped the?
Yeah, I think one of the things, just mentioning about like faster, or a lot of times sales reps, especially if they're newer, they don't have the confidence in what to write, and they get stuck and they're sitting there like, is it okay to hit send? They second guess themselves. And what we're finding with Lavender is that sales reps have confidence, whether you're first day on the job, SDR, selling to a CEO, or you've never written a sales email before, or whatever the situation is, you now have confidence to hit send, and you're not like spending a bunch of time second guessing yourself. There's also a feature, if you have complete writer's block, there's a feature we have right now in beta called Start My Email. You put in a few bullet points, and then Lavender writes a rough draft of your email for you using AI. So you have a place to start, and then you can edit it down from there. So I'd encourage you to try it out. And again, if you're a job seeker, you get Lavender for free until you find a job. So just send us an email at team@trylavender, and we'll hook you up.
That's awesome. I'm definitely going to refer some job seekers over to you guys. That's going to be a huge help. I can't wait to jump in there.
Thank you.
Very cool. Thanks for joining us, Will. This was awesome.
Thank you.